Basic blocks, sometimes referred to as slopers, make excellent building blocks. For making your own cosplay. The goal when you're making your own block is to basically create a simple 2D representation of your 3-dimensional form in as simple a way as possible. Let's get started. We start by making some guidelines. Drawing a straight line along the bottom, that's going to serve as our waistline. Another line will then be perpendicular to this, which is our center front measurement. Along the center front measurement, starting from the bottom, we're going to mark the distance from the nape to the waist. Along this line, we're also going to mark the distance from the neck to the waist, as well as the bust to the waist. We're going to then turn each of these lines into guidelines and square them all the way across. On the bust line, starting from the center front, we're going to mark half of the front bust measurement. Next, you'll square off the side seam. Remember, for this whole pattern, we're working with 1/4 of our body at a time. So bear that in mind when you're looking at the measurements that you recorded and how you're transferring those onto the paper. Next, you'll want to find the difference between half of your full shoulder measurement and the neck to shoulder measurement. You're going to mark that along the top nape line. Then, using a tape measure from that point you just marked all the way down to the neckline, you're going to create a curve that is 1/4 of your total neck circumference measurement. You can eyeball this curve roughly. Essentially, you'll be making a sort of a squashed oval shape. From the corner of the neck, you're now going to mark the neck to shoulder, or that shoulder length. This is going to go diagonally from that corner all the way to the neck guideline. For the armhole, first you're going to find the difference between the bust circumference and the underarm circumference, then half this difference. Add that difference you just found to half of the arm's eye measurement, and using your measuring tape, you're going to mark a curve from the end of the shoulder all the way down to the bust line. This will typically be a sort of a J shape. You're gonna eyeball this. I use my measuring tape and just sort of line it up so that it is the correct length and sketch this out with my pencil. At this point, we have a nice basic but unfitted bodice. So we're gonna add some fitting into the waist and the chest. First, we're going to mark along the bust line half the apex distance. Next, we're going to find the difference between the bust and the waist. This will be how much we need to shrink that waist seam by. Decide how you want to split this difference. If it's maybe less than 1 inch, you may only want to remove it from the side seam. Otherwise, you're also going to want to add in a dart. I'm going to remove 1 inch off of the side seam and have a 2-inch dart. For the side seam, find the line that you squared off previously and mark 1 inch in. Then connect the bottom of the armhole to that new line that you marked, and that will create your new side seam. For the dart, square off down from the apex. Then mark half of the dart distance on either side of that line. So in my case, 1 inch on either side. Then mark 1 inch down from the apex. Connect the lines that you marked on either side of the dart to the point that you just marked 1 inch down from the apex. This triangle now becomes your dart. We're also going to add a dart into our armhole. This is where that difference that you previously calculated between the underarm measurement and the bust measurement comes back. Find the halfway point on the armhole line. Mark that, and connect that halfway point to the apex point. Mark 1 inch away from the apex point, same as you did for the lower dart. On either side of that dart, mark half of that difference between the underarm and the bust that you had previously calculated. In my case, I'm putting 1/2 inch on either side because the difference was 1 inch. Now connect those 2 marks on either side to the apex point. You'll notice at this point, your armhole will not quite line up. And this is why I like using tracing paper or a thinner paper. You want to fold along that dart to close up the dart the way it would be when the bodice is complete, and redraw your armhole line to connect it into a nice smooth curve. Now the last piece is entirely optional, but it is my personal preference. I like converting these darts into a princess seam because I prefer seams to darts. To do that, all you do is connect each side of the dart together, drawing a nice smooth curved line. If you have a French curve, you can clean up these curves as you see fit. After that, it's time to move on to the back. First, we mark out our guidelines. If you have enough space, you can just square off your guidelines from the front half of your bodice. If not, you'll want to remark out the neck, the nape, the bust, and the waist lines, the same as you did on the front. You'll also need a perpendicular line to act as your center back. Next, you'll transfer over your neckline and your shoulder line so they're the same as the front, using the tracing paper or simply redrawing them. Next, on the bust line, mark 1/2 of the back bust circumference. Next, we're going to create our armhole. This time, you're not going to add on any extra. You're going to simply make this J-curve 1/2 of your arm side measurement. Then square off the side from the bust width, or the bottom where you marked your armhole to. Finally, you're going to need to shrink the waist. Again, like the front, depending on how much material you need to remove, you may want to separate it across darts and or the side seam. In my case, I am going to remove 1/2 inch from the side seam. Create that side seam by marking in 1/2 inch from the widest point and connecting it to the end of the armhole. Now let's create a fitted portion for the skirt or bottom. We start with our squared guidelines. This time we're going to have a top line that will act as our waist seam and a side guideline that will be our center front and or center back. On the center front, from the waistline, mark how far down from the waist to the hip. Square off your hip guideline, and on that line, mark 1/2 of your front hip measurement. Take the front bodice pieces and lay them underneath the skirt, matching the waist seam and the center front seam. Mark the positions of the center and the sides of the darts of each seam. From these marked dart positions on the waist seam, draw down to the hip line that you marked previously. Continue a straight line down from the center of these darts to create the rest of the princess seam. Repeat this process on the back to create the rest of your pattern. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I hope you found it helpful. As always, head over to my website, randomtuesday.com, for more tutorials, information, and resources. You can also watch me live on twitch.tv/randomtuesday, where I'm often working on cosplay, and I'm always happy to answer questions. You can also, as a reminder, grab a PDF version of the block that I make in this video over on my website. Let me know in the comments below what sort of video you would find helpful next. What are your cosplay or sewing related questions that I might be able to answer for you? And as always, thank you to each and every one of my patrons over on Patreon who made this video a reality. If you're able to do so, a small monthly amount over there is always appreciated. Thank you so much for watching.